Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, bonamuli namaste, jambo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you join us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show, and please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Stitcher Radio, wherever you find your podcasts. Lydia Lukidis is returning to the Reading with Your Kids podcast today to celebrate Deep, Deep Down, the secret of underwater poetry. Before we invite Lydia back into the studio, we want to invite you to connect with us on social media. Facebook.com/readingwithyourkids, at Reading With Your Kids on Instagram, at Jedley Magic on Twitter. Please be sure to check out our website, readingwithyourkids.com. You can click on the Parents Click Here button to read our blog. You can also click on the button to find out how you can bring us to your community. You can also click on the contact button at the top of the page to let us know what we're doing well, let us know what we could be doing better, and let us know who you would like to hear on a future episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Join us right now from Montreal in the beautiful province of Quebec and Canada. Our guest is returning to the show to celebrate her brand new book. It's called Deep, Deep Down, The Secret of Underwater Poetry. Please welcome back to the show, Lydia Lukidis. Hey, Lydia, bonjour, how are you?
Oh, I'm impressed with your French there, Jed.
You just heard the limit of my French. So, Lydia, how are you?
I'm doing really well. I'm so happy always to be chatting with you, and especially now that I've got an expository nonfiction book coming out in just a few months. So it's really been an exciting journey.
That's super. I love the title, Deep, Deep Down, The Secret of Underwater Poetry. I never thought of reciting poetry underwater. What's that all about?
Well, that, didn't come to me right away. So a lot of times, most of the time, when you speak to a nonfiction author working on a new book, they dive into research, literally, metaphorically, and you're learning about your subject at hand, which was for me the Mariana Trench. But now something that I learned a couple of years ago as I was trying to bridge the gap between work for hire nonfiction and trade nonfiction, because guess what? There's a huge difference. And I've been studying this for literally years, trying to make that leap. And this is the first book that's actually making that leap. Really great pioneers such as Melissa Stewart, who we all know, Kirsten Lawson, they told me something that changed the way I see nonfiction. It is not enough to simply talk about an interesting topic. So what? It's not enough. It's not deep enough. You could do it, but it will read more like an encyclopedia or, just traditional nonfiction, which there's nothing wrong with that. But I wanted to make my book exciting, so I needed a hook. And I didn't have my hook for about the first year of me actually writing the first drafts of the manuscript. So it took a while. It wasn't until I saw a video of an underwater creature that lives in the Mariana Trench called the sea cucumber, and I watched it dance. It is the most poetic thing I've ever seen. I still get chills now when I think about that video. I was mesmerized. I wanted to be in the ocean watching this creature for like 10 hours straight, the way it moved, the way it undulated. And in that moment, I think was my kind of aha moment where I said to myself, this is like moving poetry. And then the more I researched the creatures that actually live in the trench, they all have this, well, they move slowly, right? Because there's an intense pressure down there. It's like so deep. It's the deepest spot on the planet. And they move slowly, they're squishy little creatures, and they're really mesmerizing. So I think it's kind of like a big poem down there.
That is wonderful, and it's a great reminder that we learn best through stories.
Right.
Yeah. And it's something, it's frustrating because it's something that corporations know because that's how they sell us products. They don't give us facts and figures. They tell us stories. But we don't try to teach our kids through stories enough.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes tricky to do with expository literature. Like with narrative nonfiction, it's much easier to have the structure of a story because you're telling the story of somebody's life. Obviously not, from cradle to when they die, because that's much too big of a slice, but you're taking, maybe a pivotal moment in their career or something, a slice of their life. But with expository nonfiction, it's a lot harder is what I discovered, because you're not talking about a person and their story. You're talking about a scientific concept, but you have to turn that into a story. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And so for me, what ended up turning it into a story was two things: the underwater poetry aspect, which is beautiful. I'm a poet. Like that's, my first love in life was poetry always and always will be. But also the hook. And as I said, it took a year for me to figure out this hook. And the hook is that oftentimes when we think about the deep sea, and certainly the Mariana Trench, the deepest sea on the planet, what do we think lives down there? Is it, some kind of, we think of anglerfish and, creatures that look more like monsters. And so that's what I was imagining was down there. And I started doing my research, and, these animals would pop up that were kind of monstrous. But then I started interviewing experts who actually researched the trench. And it turns out that 80% of what's on the internet is false. Actually, there are no monsters down there. There are no sharks either, because sharks can't withstand that kind of pressure. So my hook became, so it's the deepest, darkest place, with hostile conditions. What do you think lives down there? Actually, it's very surprising what lives down there.
This conversation is just reminding me about how amazing our world is, and about the fact that we know so little about it.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to the ocean.
Oh, big time. I mean, the ocean covers most of our planet, and we know very little about it. And so even when it comes to the Mariana Trench, I spoke to 7 experts, scientists who researched the trench, and I even spoke to one of the first men who journeyed down to the trench. Because that to me was the closest I could get to the research, primary source, talk about primary source. This guy was in the trench. What did it feel like? What did it sound like? I remember that was one of my first questions, because as I was doing my research, I wanted to infuse some sounds into the literature. And I was like, is it silent? And it turns out it's not silent.
Really?
There are sounds that you can hear, but you wouldn't really know that from a book. You'd have to talk to someone who's been there, right? So it's an amazing thing to talk to these people and the scientists all say it can only be true if it can be verified scientifically. So we only know what we have found. What else is down there that maybe we don't yet know about?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When I was co-hosting Solve It for Kids, we spoke to a number of oceanographers, and even here on the Reading with Your Kids podcast, we had Dr. Sylvia Earle, her deepness on the podcast, and it's mind-boggling to think that we know more about the moon and some planets and objects that are light years away from us than we know about the ocean, that I can literally hop on my bike and have my foot in the ocean from my house here in Boston. It would take me less than a half an hour.
Absolutely. And that's not for lack of effort. I mean, it is really painstaking to actually research the trench, but it is so difficult because it's so damn deep, right? So that is the problem that we have. And so we need submersibles. We need these drop traps that they'll send down to the bottom of the ocean. There needs to be a way to do this research, and it is painstaking. It is tedious. So much work goes into all of these wonderful discoveries. And it was a real treat to talk to Dr. Geringer, who literally answered maybe over 200 of my questions. So she's been really an amazing source of information. And just to talk about the process of how she gathers the information and how they're learning things. But that science is still evolving, right? We're still learning more. We can't say, well, now we know everything about the trench. We don't.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, what a wonderful book to sit with our kids to read together. It's because it's it's like giving your kid a key to an imagination engine. It's like, okay, well, this is what we know about the trench. This is what we know about the ocean. This is some of what we know about the ocean. So what else do you think is yet to be discovered? And that can be
exciting.
Fun.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say that can be a fun conversation, a fun series of conversations to have with our kids.
Absolutely. I mean, the book is coming out January 1st, 2023, so I'll be starting my school visits. And one of the premises I'm going to lead with is, well, what do you guys think lives down there? And I'm going to show them a bunch of pictures, but also to talk about those hostile conditions I was mentioning earlier, like lack of sunlight. Like there is no sunlight whatsoever. Lack of food. Food is very scarce down there, but also the intense pressure. So given those three factors, what kind of creatures can actually not only survive, but thrive? Like I didn't know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So what kind of creatures are able to thrive in that environment?
Well, I'm not going to give everything away because I definitely want everyone to read the book if they can, but I'll give you a few examples. So for me, when I started the research, I was hoping there would be all these kind of monsters living down there, like anglerfish. Everyone's obsessed with anglerfish and, vampire squid, so on and so forth. Well, none of them live down there. So at first I was disappointed. I was like, oh, that was my idea, was to, feature all of these, quote unquote scary creatures, but they're not. And that's something that Dr. Geringer taught me. She said, a lot of people equate the deep sea with scary. And we really want to dispel that myth. She was talking about it quite seriously. She's like, we need to teach children that it's not that scary down there. It's beautiful and, as I said before, mesmerizing. So one such creature would be the sea cucumber that I mentioned before. Such a beautiful creature. It doesn't have a bone in its body. Also the snailfish. And I didn't know what a snailfish was, I will confess, until I researched this book. Turns out it's the fish that can live the deepest on the entire planet. So it can thrive in the trench and survive, and, very, very small, kind of slippery creatures. But I never knew about this. So a lot of the creatures, I will bet, children have never heard of. So it helps them learn about biology, but also about geology, like how the trench was formed and so on and so forth. There's like a lot of scientific themes that are intertwined in the book.
Yeah. And one of the things that we've been advocating for here on the podcast is for parents to really embrace the idea that they are their child's first and most important teacher. That what we model for our kids is something that they're most likely going to imitate. And if our kids see us read, they're most likely to read. If our kids see us doing, engaging in habits that aren't so healthy for us, they're more likely to do that. But if our kids see us being curious about the world, being curious about the ocean, that's going to really ignite their curiosity.
Absolutely. I mean, I grew up in a very, very intelligent and literate and deeply philosophical family. So I grew up with all these deep philosophical conversations going on around me when I was very young. My mother to this day is an extraordinary reader. My brother has actually more books than me, if you can believe it, all on Greek history. He's obsessed with Greek history. And so I grew up with people reading all the time. And I remember my mother saying, I will buy you whatever book you want. So there will be no question. It wasn't like toys. There was a limit to how many toys I could have. She didn't buy me that many, or clothes. But with books, there was no limit. And so I became a voracious reader. I started reading when I was 4, and I still read today, obviously for my job, but also for enjoyment. And I'm happy to say my daughter now is a big reader. And, it took her longer to get into it. And I was concerned at first. I was like, how could I be an author? And my daughter doesn't like reading. And then she just came into it on her own. When I said to her the same thing that my mother said to me, I will buy you whatever book you want. You choose your own books. And now I regret saying that because she's trying to read ahead of her comprehension level. Like she's 11 reading YA, which is fine. But you do have to kind of monitor because there's some YA that wouldn't be appropriate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, absolutely. We, again, we're responsible for our kids. We have to care for them. And we are, I think as parents, we're in the best position to make decisions about those kind of things for our kids.
Absolutely. And educators play a big role as well. Like I still remember my librarian from West Park School, where I went to elementary school, and she was reading the book The Witches to us by Roald Dahl, and she started wearing gloves that day. So if you know the book, you'll get the reference there. And I remember being so enthralled that I went home to my mother and I said, I need to read every book that Roald Dahl has ever written. And I did. And I still to this day love his books. And so the what we're exposed to at school really can either resonate with us or not. That's fine. I'm not saying children need to love everything they come into contact with, but teachers have a really big platform, you know what I mean, by exposing children to different types of literature.
I want to take a minute just to kind of go off, digress just a little bit. I was recently speaking to a publisher who is bringing authors from Latin America, kids authors from Latin America, bringing their books to the States. And in our conversation, he said that there was very, very much a difference between what's written for kids in Latin America and what's written for kids here in the States. I'm wondering, Canada, we're kind of like very close cousins. But we are different countries, we are different cultures, and especially in Quebec, which is predominantly French speaking. Again, that's even the culture there is even different from the rest of Canada. Do you notice that there's a difference in the kind of children's literature that's written in Quebec or Canada than is written in the States?
I think you nailed it right there. I mean, first of all, it's very French here in Quebec, as you know. And so a lot of the illustrious authors that are Québécois, they're French. And so they write in French. So there's not such a huge market for Anglophone books here as one would think. However, there's a lot of really great, solid houses, like publishing houses that publish Canadian books. And I do read them. I think one of the chief differences is the setting will always, will predominantly be taking place in Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver or in the Maritimes. And so it changes the story culturally in that aspect. But when it comes down to core themes, I really think it's universal. Like a kid in Japan would have the same issues as a kid here as in Mexico. Of course, there'll be differences, but I'm talking about the core issues are very similar. But funny thing, I'm Canadian. I love to support Canadian literature. But I've never actually been published by a Canadian house yet. That'll come. It's just that my agent is American, and so she deals predominantly with American publishers. So I don't have that experience yet. But I do read them, and there's some really great houses here that consistently come out with great books.
Yeah. Well, I'm really happy that you use that word "yet," because we're always encouraging families to teach that to their kids. My niece, who is just entered a biomedical engineering program at a university. One of the things that I taught her when she was younger, and it annoyed her at the time, hopefully she appreciates it, is I told her you can only use the words "I can't" as long as she adds "yet" at the end.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that. And I grew up with two very strong parents who always told me, because they came here as Greek immigrants, they didn't know anybody. My dad did not even speak French. My mother had to go with him to the job interviews to translate the questions into English, and they built a great life for themselves. And so my parents always taught me, you can do anything you put your mind to. And so now I'm trying to relay that message to my daughter. So I agree with you, and I don't think it fell on deaf ears, even though in certain moments it feels like what you say to your kids goes in one ear and out the other. They're actually retaining it. They might just not show it.
Yeah.
Yes. At least that's what I hope.
Oh, yeah. And you'll probably get it back. Your daughter will probably come to you someday and with this big revelation and say, I've decided this, and just kind of repeat back something that you told her 6 months ago or a year ago or 2 years ago. And the best thing is just sit back and go, wow, that's amazing. I wish I had told you that.
I did something right. Well, she did say to me the other day, which I thought was really profound, that because I never pretend to be a perfect parent. And so we have very honest discussions about life, things that happen. And she said to me, Mom, I learned through your experiences. I was like, wow, good, cool, okay. That's great.
Yeah. What's the most, so getting back to deep down, the secret of underwater poetry, other than discovering that there's this poetry and beauty in the Mariana Trench, what's the most surprising thing you discovered during your research?
Well, just the fact that you've got all these hostile conditions and there's still a lot going on down there. You know, I mean, that was pretty amazing to me. And I didn't know much about the Hadal Zone. Like, I knew deep sea as just the deep sea. And then as I got deeper into the research, literally, I learned about the different levels of the ocean and that the Hadal is on the bottom, really only good for trenches. And it was so fascinating to me, the Hadal Zone. I had never thought about that. And that there's scientists who devote their entire lives to studying just that zone of the ocean. Isn't that amazing? And I ended up speaking to a geologist who studies how trenches form and the plates moving and so on and so forth. Everything that I learned just blew me away, because we do live in a beautiful world, and we don't even know how beautiful it is sometimes on a conscious level, you know, of how you're sitting on this beautiful island. Well, how did that island form? You know what I mean? And so diving into this, I really learned, and it started out, the inspiration, with something sad that I read on the internet. In 2019, researchers found plastic in the trench. And I remember reading that article, and I was like, I had heard of the Mariana Trench, did not know anything about it other than the fact that it was the deepest trench on our planet. And just hearing that this pristine, perfect, you know, location that was so far from human that we've managed to stain that. There was a plastic bag floating in the trench, and also they found plastic ingested by the creatures. I cannot believe that we are affecting the creatures. And so I wanted to know more about them. And then I dove into my research and, you know, discovered that everything was wrong. So I had to I rewrote my script 55 times. So that was fun. So when I met my group of experts, they quickly showed me what was wrong and what I had written, which was most of it. So it's really a great reminder to all writers out there. Even if you're reading from a reputable website, it's not necessarily true, all the information that's being put out there. So you really need to talk to those experts.
Yeah. And that's a really important message for us to, and again, something that we've been talking about here is helping our kids decide and discern what information sources they can trust.
Right. I mean, you know, there weren't that many books on the Mariana Trench when I went to the library the first time. As I got deeper into my research and I spoke to some experts, I found books that were amazing, but I would have never looked up a book on the Hadal Zone. Like, what did I know about that, what even was? So I only got to those books later, but I have to say there's not that much written out there. You really have to talk to the experts, the people who have researched it, who are there every day, who are examining these creatures, who are cataloging everything. And then piece by piece, and it's not even one expert, it was 8. Because, you know, one expert couldn't tell me about the geology, but then the expert who knew about biology, well, she couldn't answer all the questions about the color of the sea cucumber. Like, every little detail, I had to go to a sea cucumber expert. You know what I mean? So it really brought me deep into this world, and I thought it was fascinating. Here's a doctor, a scientist, who only studies sea cucumbers. Isn't that amazing?
That is amazing. And it's just another great reminder that we do live in this beautiful world. We know a lot about it, but there's still a lot that is left to be discovered. And wouldn't it be wonderful if we could excite our kids and get them to think that they might be doing some of the discovering?
Oh, absolutely, that's true. And that's always what I tell my daughter, what I tell my students. The point is to inspire them. You know, we want to educate with our books, of course, but really the end goal is to inspire them. And I mean, what an amazing thing. I mean, the deep sea is a topic that's obviously very popular, but I did have trouble selling it, because I was coming from the work for hire world. And so my writing was very quote unquote educational. And I was, as I said, trying to make that leap into trade. I had a lot of trouble. I'm not going to lie. I talked to all the greats and finally got there, and I'm here now, and the door's open, but it's still a lot of work. But it was not easy.
Yeah, I'm sure it's not. Hey, you know, one thing that should be easy for you is to remind us where we can go to find out more about Deep, Deep Down and more about you.
Absolutely. My website, of course, so www.lydialukidis.com. Everything you'll want to know about me is there, my bio, my books, where you can buy my books. So everything in a one-stop shop kind of thing to make life easy.
We've had a great time speaking to the author of Deep, Deep Down, The Secret of Underwater Poetry. And our guest has been our friend Lydia Lukidis. Hey, Lydia, thanks so much for being back with us.
Thank you so much, Jed. Have a great day.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. Lauren Pyland will be here to celebrate Blooming Rose. It's a great series, and we'll be talking about Blooming Rose Blast Off. That's the next episode of the podcast. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we're going to start by thanking our guest, Lydia Lukidis. Please be sure to check out Deep, Deep Down. Also want to thank my teams, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Jordan Saley, Stephanie Davila. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today, and as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.